In 1857, a seemingly peaceful wagon train of about 120 immigrants journeying from Arkansas to California faced unimaginable tragedy in southern Utah's Mountain Meadow. Misinformation, deep-rooted tensions, and misunderstanding turned this serene valley into the site of one of the darkest episodes in American West history. Now, believing that these immigrants posed a threat, a group of religious zealots and their allies launched an attack that led to the tragic massacre. This video is going to delve into the complex history, the rising tensions of the Utah territory, and the lasting impact of this horrific event. And I hope you'll join us as we explore the layers behind this misunderstood tragedy in history. Let's examine how fear and mistrust can lead to heartbreaking mistakes. Hey, thanks for joining Profiling Evil and welcome. We're here where the Mountain Meadow Massacre happened. So please take a minute, hit that like and subscribe button so that you get more of our videos in this new series I'm doing, Twisted Tales. Now, Twisted Tales is a journey into mysterious events where strange occurrences and unsolved cases are brought into the spotlight for curious minds. In each episode, we're going to quickly dive into the real-life enigmas. We're going to examine theories, evidence, and historical accounts to uncover the hidden mysteries in these cases. It's a forum where you, the viewer, can contribute insights, spark constructive discussion, and just maybe help crack a case that's been baffling people for decades. From long ago, forgotten secrets to modern mysteries, Twisted Tales invites you to question everything that you think you know about a particular case. So let's talk about the Mountain Meadow Massacre. I'm going to take you back to September of 1857. There was a contingent of territorial militia operating in this area of southern Utah. It was comprised of Mormon settlers. Now, the Mormons are today known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And these militiamen, alongside Native American allies that they'd recruited into their scheme, executed a premeditated attack on a wagon train of immigrants traveling from Arkansas to California. The militia, acting with clear intent, carried out the mass killings that resulted in the deaths of 120 men, women, and children in what is now known as this area, Mountain Meadow and the Mountain Meadow Massacre. Only 17 young children who were deemed too innocent to serve as credible witnesses to the events, were spared of murder. This crime stands out as one of the most grievous acts associated with the history of the Latter-day Saint faith people. And I want to point out that this horrific murder was committed by men who were members of the Latter-day Saint faith. It wasn't committed by the church. And I think it's important to separate the evil actions of men from the teachings of a traditional faith and a faith tradition. Now, while individuals within any faith tradition may sometimes commit terrible acts, the actions of those people don't reflect the values or the beliefs of the entire faith community. And it should not be defined that way. Faith traditions, at their very core, promote principles of compassion, justice, and peace. The actions of those who deviate from these teachings are a violation of the very values that these churches claim to represent. Now, some of our listeners out there are going to probably be quick to judge, and I hope if that's you, that we might look at this case with a desire to understand, to learn, and to never repeat such violence. The vast majority of believers of all faiths, at least those that I'm aware of, live in accordance with the ethical and moral tenets of that faith. They're among the first to denounce things like violence, hatred, and harm in all forms. So in my opinion, it is unjust and inaccurate to judge an entire faith by the actions of a small number of individuals who have chosen to act against its true teachings. But in this case, regardless, these murders happened. And many say they were committed in the name of religious belief. You know, for me, the more important thing that I've learned as I've studied this one is the danger that comes when people follow somebody else without thinking for themselves. The immigrant wagon train arrived in the Utah Territory during a period of heightened religious fervor known as the Reformation. It was occurring all across all faiths in the United States and inside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Church leaders were issuing fiery sermons talking about repentance and spiritual renewal. During this time, intense rhetoric was employed, often painting dissenters and external threats as these really stark-termed ways. This discourse escalated tensions between the Latter-day Saints and their neighbors, including those federal authorities who had been assigned to the territory. Now, the situation was worsening in the early 1857 time period, when President James Buchanan, President of the United States, was informed by reports from federal officials in Utah that the Latter-day Saints were rebelling against U.S. authority. Now, there was rebellion going on with polygamy and other things. Buchanan responded by dispatching a federal army to Utah to replace Governor Young as governor, initiating what became known as the Utah War. Fearing a repeat of prior violent expulsions that the Saints had experienced in Missouri and Illinois, the Latter-day Saints anticipated conflict, especially after one of their leaders, a guy named Parley P. Pratt, a prominent church leader, was murdered in May of 1807, and in no other place than Arkansas. News of Pratt's killing, combined with inflammatory reports from eastern newspapers, reached Utah, further exacerbating the fears of external aggression. President Young responded by declaring martial law and ordered missionaries and settlers to return to the Salt Lake Valley, and he prepared his militia to defend their land. His rhetoric, along with the impending federal intervention, contributed to this charged atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Then comes along this westward bound band of travelers from Arkansas. They were led by two men, a guy named Baker-Fancher and John Baker. And as the travelers passed through the Salt Lake Valley, disputes started erupting between the immigrants, the wagon train, and the citizens in Salt Lake over grazing rights for the livestock. They had a ton of livestock, and there were problems right from the beginning. Additionally, the immigrants encountered difficulty as they tried to acquire supplies, again, due to that wartime restriction on trade that Young put in place. Frightened by these challenges, some members of the wagon train allegedly threatened to join any incoming federal troops in attacking the Saints. Now, these threats, while ignored by many, were taken seriously by others, especially down here in southern Utah. In southern Utah, local church and militia leaders took a more extreme approach to this thing, and they authorized one of their militia leaders, a guy named John D. Lee, to lead an armed attack on the immigrants. This plan was initially challenged by other leaders in the area who sought to delay the action, saying, "We've got to consult with Governor Young." The dissenters were demanding that Brigham Young be contacted and consulted regarding the plan without moving forward. But without their consent, it appears that the assault began before any further direction could be received. Now, Lee left his home a day before the siege in the company of 14 Native Americans, headed toward Mountain Meadow. In the early morning hours of Monday, September 7th, the wagon train members were attacked, by all accounts, by as many as 200 Paiute warriors and militiamen who were disguised as Native Americans. Yeah, are you kidding that? The white guys disguised themselves to look like they were Native American to put the blame on the Paiute tribe. Well, the attackers were hidden in a small ravine just south of the immigration camp when the attack began. And the immigrants, I'm going to refer to them probably from time to time as the Baker-Fancher party, defended themselves by circling their wagons, lowering them, and digging shallow trenches around them to create a barrier so they could defend themselves. In the hours of the opening attack, 7 immigrants were killed, and they were buried somewhere inside where those wagons were circled over the next 5 days. 16 additional people were wounded in that first attack, and the besieged families sat there for 5 days as skirmishes occurred, and their water ran out. And so with no water, there was a report that I read where they dressed up a little girl in a white dress and sent her out to a nearby spring in hopes of getting some water. Well, the child was shot at by the militiamen, but she escaped unharmed. Then they came up with an idea and sent 2 horsemen out to retrieve water, but one of them was shot. But here's something interesting. The other man that wasn't shot noticed that the shooter was a white man. That changed all things inside the camp as they started to wonder what on earth is going on. And then, on Friday, September 11th, the attackers devised a plan of trickery, and they had a group of men approach the settlers bearing a white flag of truce. Lee led the conversation and lied to the settlers, saying that he had negotiated the truce with the Paiutes and that his men were standing by to safely escort the settlers to the nearby community where they would be protected. Now, in exchange, he said the Paiutes demanded that the settlers leave their livestock and their supplies to the Native Americans, of which the settlers agreed. I mean, they were busted, worn, and dying. They needed to get out of there, and they accepted all the terms. As part of this video, I want to also reference a book called Vengeance is Mine by Richard E. Turley and Barbara Jones Brown. This is a book that was written about the Meadows Massacre, and I actually went over to a podcast called Faith Matters and grabbed a couple of comments from them. In the book, which was written in 2008, Vengeance is Mine documents how Southern Utah leaders attempted to cover up their crimes by silencing witnesses and spreading lies. Investigations by both governmental and church bodies were stymied by stonewalling and political wrangling. And I would just encourage you to look at that book or consider picking up that book if you want to learn more about this. But I want to just use that clip from the Faith Matters podcast, things that I think are applicable to what we're talking about.
They make the horrible decision, as Rick was saying, to call out the militia because they think, oh, we've got to wipe out all the witnesses. There's another wagon train that's coming behind them, and if they come on the scene, on the trail, and see this, then you have even more witnesses. So they're thinking cover up. Mm-hmm. So they decide to wipe out these witnesses inside. The militiamen are called out, sent to the Meadows. They arrive sometime in the middle of the night, Thursday, September 10th, and early morning, September 11th. They're told what they're going to do. They go and they line up along the trail outside of the wagon corral. William Bateman and John D. Lee, they bring their own white flag, walk towards the wagon corral to signal that they're there to help them.
Which is part of the treachery.
Which is part of the horrific treachery. And then they allow John D. Lee inside their wagon corral. He says, we're here to save you. We're here to protect you. We're going to lead you back to the settlements safely. And he says the Indians are mad at the men because some of them have been killed in these initial attacks. And of course, these debates are going on inside. You have some of the immigrant men, they're saying, no, you're crazy. This is treachery. They doubt it. But they also are so desperate. They've used up all their ammunition over the past 5 days. Mm-hmm. They've been under siege. They also don't have water And you can imagine the heat in the September sun and without access to water, with countless and numerous children as well. So they are so desperate, they agree and they decide to trust Lee and these militiamen. So they turn over their guns. Their guns are placed inside of 2 Mormon wagons that they bring inside of the corral. And Lee directs that the 2 wagons leave the corral first. And in the back of the wagons are the youngest children and wounded, as well as guns. Then the women and children leave next. And then behind them, the men and the oldest teenage boys come out. When the men and oldest teenage boys line up along the trail next to the militiamen, each who are carrying a gun, they cheer for them. They think that they are there to rescue them. And the whole procession begins to walk northward out of the mountain meadows. At a given spot about a mile north, where there is thick sagebrush and oak that grows right around the trail, a number of Native Americans are hiding there, directed by Nephi Johnson, who is an interpreter. He speaks Paiute. And at a given signal, the men in the militia line, they turn to the immigrant men at their left and shoot them in the head. A few run off, and they are chased down by men on horseback and their throats slit. And then Nephi Johnson gives the signal for Indians to rush out where they have been hiding and kill the women and children. The white militiamen go forward and they help to continue to kill the women and children. Anyone they find that is not dead yet, they shoot in the head. They kill all of the children who are considered too old to tell tales. The oldest 2 children who are spared are only 6 years old. Most of the children who are spared are age 2 and under. It's a horrific crime.
17 of the youngest children, along with a few mothers and the wounded, were put inside wagons, which were followed by a second group of older women and older children walking in this group behind the wagons. Then a third group was created. The surviving men, each accompanied by an armed militiaman, walked toward town. The guards strategically allowed the groups to separate, and they kept them kind of visually separated by small depressions and sagebrush, kind of like you see here. And then an order was shouted, and the guards turned and massacred all of the remaining settlers. Every man, woman, and young child was gunned down. Everybody, except those 17 children who were deemed too young to testify. Under the guise of safe passage, the immigrants were lured from their fortified position only to be brutally massacred by the militia, aided by the Native American participants. Again, in total, 120 people were murdered that day. Just 2 days after the massacre, a letter from Governor Brigham Young arrived advising the local leaders to refrain from interfering with the immigrants. He told them to allow them to pass through southern Utah unmolested. However, the massacre had already been carried out, and in an attempt to cover up their criminal actions, the militia falsely placed blame on their Native American allies. Can you imagine? They threw them under the bus on this one. And while those who participated in the massacre remained tight-lipped, word started to leak out about the horrors of that day. Now, the Utah War was finally settled, but the Civil War was in full swing in the years that followed. So it would actually take until 1874 before 9 men were indicted for the crimes. And of those men that were indicted, only John Lee was tried in a court of law. Now, here's a picture of those 4 of those 9 men. I couldn't find the others. But it took 2 trials before they convicted Lee of murder. And he was executed on the same site here at Mountain Meadow. Well, I wanted to show you the area and the 3 monuments that have been erected to memorialize those 120 lives that were taken so long ago. I'm going to start at the Women's and the Children's Memorial, located several miles north of the massacre site. And as I take this drone up into the air, I'm going to have it kind of follow the truck, my truck, back toward the Men's Memorial, which is about 3/4 of a mile to the south. Now keep in mind, many of the settlers were murdered somewhere in the tundra between the Women's Memorial and the site of the large rock memorial where the wagons were circled, place where that rock memorial is. Now, as we travel south from the Women's Memorial, we come to the Men's Memorial. Again, about 3/4 of a mile south of the Women's and the Children's Memorial. It's dedicated to the men that were murdered in this massacre. Then we're going to go approximately a half a mile further to the south of the Men's Memorial, to the place where the wagons were circled about for those 5 days during the siege. Now, as you look at the gravesite memorial, keep in mind that in May of 1859, almost 2 years to the date of the massacre, a group of U.S. Army soldiers created a rock pile called a cairn to commemorate the bodies that were there. In fact, they recovered the bodies of 34 members of the Arkansas wagon train. The soldiers used that trench that was dug by the wagon train members during the attack as their mass grave. Now, they also buried, reportedly, the other people who were murdered in 2 other mass graves in the valley out here. Well, over the 20 years that followed that, the original memorial was damaged by vandalism, floods, and erosion. In 1932, the Utah Trails and Landmark Association built a small stone wall around this site, and in 1999, after years of neglect, the memorial received renewed attention, and it came from volunteers from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who prepared the site for the memorial that stands here today. In fact, the current memorial contains stones from the original cairn memorial. And if you don't know what a cairn is, it's that stack of stones used for memorials in the 1800s, kind of like headstones or a way to protect the body from being dug up. Now, in the process of constructing the memorial that you see in this video, workers also found the bodies of 29 more people. Those bones were reinterred in a crypt that's now marked by a little engraved granite paver just at the northeast corner of the wall surrounding the monument. Relatives of the victims wrapped the bones in beautiful, hand-woven shrouds, and they encased them in oak ossuaries. These ossuaries were respectfully placed, get this, on a thin layer of Arkansas soil. And in another touching service conducted on September 9th of 2017, the relatives of one small child who was killed in that siege buried that child's remains, a skull, at the site, also pictured here. In the early 2000s, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints did the right thing, in my opinion, and they undertook a comprehensive investigation into the events that occurred at Mountain Meadow, opening all of the relevant historical records for examination. Now, that examination resulted in a 2000 scholarly publication by Oxford University Press that concluded that the local church leaders, not the official church headquarters leaders, the local leaders made ill-fated decisions that culminated in the mass killing of the settlers. They stated that these bad decisions were influenced by the broader context of the Utah War and the heightened tensions with the U.S. government. Regardless, 120 people were murdered on this site.
So one of the most important principles to remember is that no one alive today had anything to do with the Mountain Meadows Massacre. However, we are all responsible for how we deal with the subject. It is a natural human inclination to want to rehabilitate an ancestor who you've discovered has done something wrong. So people lapse into a mode of denial or an effort to try to justify what was done, and that is exactly the wrong approach. That will not bring about healing. That will not bring about reconciliation. If you talk to the descendants of the victims, they will talk about two major things that are important to them. Number one, that we tell the truth, that we acknowledge the story, and with that, express sorrow about what happened. To say, I'm sorry for what my ancestor did is an important part of healing if you're the descendant of a perpetrator. Number two, the bones of the victims still lie at the Mountain Meadows. We've had people approach us and say, why are you talking about this? Barbara was saying she read comments in a recent newspaper article.
Why are we talking about this subject again?
And my answer is to say, why do we continue to talk about Carthage? You know, if you live in Carthage, Illinois, the Carthage massacre, as it's sometimes called, is not your proudest moment. And yet, the people of Carthage, Illinois, allow us to talk about the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram Smith because it's very important to our story, our culture, and even our ancestry for some people. And so it is with the Mountain Meadows. We think it's a very positive healing thing that rather than let the Mountain Meadows property just sort of get consumed by development, the church purchased it and paid to have consultants come in and have it be made a National Historic Landmark. So rather than forget about it and deny that our ancestors were there, we can acknowledge it, learn from it, and grow. The reality is this: history is messy. I said a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Sometimes people go into the study of history thinking, oh, I'm going to discover all these wonderful things about my ancestry, my church, my nation, my cultural identity, my people, whatever the case may be. And you'll find things that are good and you'll find things that are not good. Some people are unable to deal with ambiguity. They're unable to deal with uncertainty. And history is all about that. So one of the most important things that we can do as members of the church is to recognize that messiness of history and learn how to deal with ambiguity and uncertainty. Imagine this type of intergenerational trauma is very, very difficult to get rid of. And it has a factual basis. You know, when you meet a descendant of a victim and they say, your people killed my ancestors, and they traumatized the surviving children from whom I descend, you can understand that there'd be a great deal of emotion surrounding that. But most of the relatives of victims that we've encountered are good, honest,
dear friends now.
Wonderful people, many of them deeply religious. And we have become, as Barbara said, dear friends with them. And that same book of scripture that says, vengeance is mine, is essentially the Lord saying, do not wreak vengeance on others. That's my responsibility. And then he goes on to say, basically, feed your enemies. Be kind to them. So we should replace any type of feeling of animosity with feelings of love and tolerance.
But that's from Romans. And then 2 verses below that, it says, be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good.
In concluding this Twisted Tales video by Profiling Evil, where we've journeyed through this tragic chapter in history, hopefully shedding light on horrific events from that 1857 Mountain Meadow Massacre, where 120 innocent people were murdered, we want to do something a little differently. We want to talk about this senseless violence carried out by a faction of crazy people. These decisions starkly contrast the values held by the larger church that those people were associated with, which was uninvolved by all accounts and backed up after looking at this. Years later, the church, though, took a compassionate step forward. The church also offered an apology to the families of the victims as a gesture of healing, signifying a desire to bring some measure of solace to the families and reaffirm a commitment to peace moving forward. Now, while the past can't be undone, this act serves as a reminder that it's possible to acknowledge and learn from past wrongs, that we can nurture hope for a future built on understanding, compassion, and the commitment to never repeat such tragedies. I'd like to know your thoughts on this video, and I hope that you'll put them down below. And please remember to be kind and constructive in your comments. Take time to read each other's comments and weigh in. I really hope you've enjoyed the imagery from the area that I shot today, and I hope that it helps you better understand what occurred in Mountain Meadow on September 11th, 1857. I hope you're enjoying this new segment that I'm calling Twisted Tales. I'm really excited about it because it gives me a chance to look at old cases that are no longer talked about without the emotion of the current case. Hey, please make sure that you're finding balance in your true crime consumption. You know, too much ugliness results in more ugliness. So make sure you spend some time doing good things and that you're involved in uplifting activities that help you realize there is great hope for our future. As we move into the holiday season ahead, I hope that you find an opportunity to be more inclusive and kinder in your interactions with those around you. Please look for Profiling Evil on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you like audio podcasts, make sure you're tuning in to Profiling Evil podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget about checking out our website at profilingevil.com, where you can sign up for our digital newsletter, the BOLO. BOLO stands for Be on the Lookout. And the only way that you're going to get this digital newsletter is to sign up. And I promise that I'll never share your contact information with anybody. So thanks for your support of Profiling Evil. We'll see you soon at the next crime scene.